You know, one of the things I love to do is I love to camp. Does anybody love camping? Anybody? There's a few campers out here. Happy campers, right? That's why we all smiled earlier. You know, I love camping, and I try to camp, whenever I've got an opportunity. I have a little teeny tiny cabin. It's more like a shack up in the woods. And that's kind of like my place where I like to just kind of get away. Sometimes I'll spend a night or two there. Sometimes I'll spend like almost a week there and try to do like a sabbatical, try to read a book, or do a whole bunch of sermon planning all at once. And I just love to go out in the woods. And this past Sunday, I try to get up there at least once a month. I got a little wood stove there. And this past Sunday night, I spent the night in the woods. And have you ever been camping and then and especially at nighttime, you hear like a noise and you know it's close and you know that it's an animal of some sort? Anybody? What do you do in those moments? And you're all by yourself, other than cry, One of the things that I know I do, hypothetically, this last weekend, is I stoke the fire up a little bit more, right? You hear something, you're like, aren't wild animals supposed to be scared of fire? So you stoke the fire up. And so this is what I know. That you can find some great protection in the fire. Between that and a .45 caliber pistol and with a flashlight and laser sights, you feel pretty confident out there in the woods. Once again, that's hypothetical. There's firepower, right? So, but there's some protection that you find in that fire, especially when you're out all by yourself and you feel like there's nothing around there that can stop you, or nothing that can help you, You find that protection in the fire. Well, today we're going to talk about a story in the Old Testament where there was a considerable amount of protection in the fire. But the issue was that in this story, they were in the fire. Not like near the fire, finding their protection. They were actually in the fire when they found some incredible protection. And all of that protection was because of the presence of God in their lives. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're in this series called Campfire Stories. This is the second part of the series. We're going to do a couple more. But we're looking at these stories, and this kind of a collection of stories from the Old Testament. And once again, when we say stories, we're talking about true stories. Stories aren't just all made up, right? These are stories that actually took place. So we've been looking at a couple stories, and these things have at least two things in common. One, fire is kind of a central theme to all of these stories. That's why we've called it Campfire Stories. And the second thing is this, that each of these stories remind us of the presence of God. They're stories about the presence of God. And like we said last week, recognizing God's presence always makes a difference. I hope that you've recognized that this week, that recognizing God's presence always makes a difference in your life. Last week we talked about the promise of God's presence, and this week we're going to talk about the protection found in God's presence. So go ahead and turn in your Bibles to Daniel chapter 3. Daniel chapter 3, if you're using one of our Bibles, is page 721. 721. If you don't have a Bible, feel free to take that one home with you. But we're in Daniel chapter 3, and I do feel like I need to give you some background information. And so to help with this background information, we're going to look at a timeline here. And this timeline kind of walks you through some of the events in the Old Testament. And last week we talked a little bit about the call of Abraham. We'll talk a little bit about Abraham next week. But the call of Abraham, somewhere around in 2089 BC, God said, "Listen, I'm going to choose a person, and I'm going to make myself known to the entire world through this person and through his family." So God chooses Abraham. He's going to make this huge, tremendous nation, this family. Things go well for a while, right? You have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Maybe you've heard of those guys. We talked a little bit about them briefly last week. Well, Jacob has a bunch of sons, 12 actually. One of them, his name is Joseph. Joseph becomes a powerful leader in Egypt. Of course, there's a whole bunch of other things in that story, but you can check that out sometime in the book of Genesis. Joseph becomes the second in command in Egypt. While they're in Egypt, the nation grows. Somewhere around 1730 or so BC, the nation is just becoming very populous. Things aren't going so well for them because they're in slavery for 300 to 400 years or so. And then God calls Moses. They've been crying out for a deliverer. God calls Moses somewhere around 1445 BC. That was the story we looked at last week, Moses in the burning bush. It says, hey, you're going to go to Pharaoh and you're going to tell him, hey, let my people go, right? You've heard of that? And so that's somewhere around 1445 BC. Well, around 1382, there's a period known as the Judges, and Israel is ruled by a series of judges that kind of are like military leaders / political leaders, but largely military leaders, people like Gideon and Samson and Deborah and Ehud. And so that's kind of somewhat of their leadership structure at that time and how God was providing protection for the nation of Israel through these people. Well, they kind of call out and cry out for a king. Man, we want to be like all the other nations. God, just give us a king. We want to be like everybody else. And God reluctantly answers that prayer request. Has God ever reluctantly answered one of your prayer requests? And then when you're done, you're like, oh man, I wish he would not have answered that one. Yeah, well, that's kind of how it was for the nation of Israel. God gives them a king. In fact, you see Israel's first king in 1051 BC. His name is Saul. He has some good moments, but a lot of bad moments. Then you have Saul, and then his successor is King David, who is a good king, and then Solomon. So those are kind of like the glory days for the kingdom of Israel as they were all united. Well, something happens a little bit later on, 931 BC is the divided kingdom. All of a sudden the kingdom, has this major fraction that takes place, and you have the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, in the northern kingdom, they still go by the name of Israel. And the southern kingdom, they go by the name of Judah. Okay, and hopefully this will all make sense here in a little bit. So in 722, they have some more issues, things that take place. You have the Assyrian captivity, and that's when the northern kingdom of Israel is taken into captivity by the Assyrians, and they become a part of the Assyrian Empire. Well, in 605 BC is known as the Babylonian captivity. There is going to be a test, by the way, so just so you know, hopefully you're getting all these dates down. I'm just trying to set some context, okay? So 605 is the Babylonian kingdom, or the Babylonian captivity, and that's when the southern kingdom of Israel, known as Judah, is taken into captivity, and they become a part of the Babylonian Empire. So you see kind of this, a huge variety of things that are kind of going on in their life as a nation. And that's kind of the context of what we're going to talk about today, is the Babylonian captivity and the Babylonian Empire. In Daniel chapter 1, you should be in Daniel chapter 3, but if you just look back a page or so. Daniel chapter 1, you see this. It says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, remember, Judah is the southern half of the kingdom, okay, the southern kingdom. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Okay, so the king of Babylon comes and he takes over. He besieges that city, and all of a sudden, captivity takes place. Well, when Nebuchadnezzar invaded, one of the things that he wanted to do is he wanted to convert the Israelites, and he wanted to change them. He wanted to change their culture. And so one of the ways that he did that is he gathered some of the best and some of the brightest of the culture, some of the best and brightest of the young men who were also members of either the royal family or they were of other nobles in Israel or in Judah. And his goal was to take these intelligent young men and to train them in the way of the Babylonians. That was kind of his goal. Then we read in verse 6, Daniel 1, verse 6. It says, among those who were chosen were some from Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So these are some of the guys that were taken, and they get their names changed. Verse 7 says, the chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, he gave the name Belteshazzar. By the way, if you're looking for some baby names, here's some good ones. I think they're still available, right? Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, he gave the name Shadrach, and to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. Or if you're a fan of the Veggie Tales, anybody know what they are? Rack, Shack, and Benny. Rack, Shack, and Benny, yeah. In most of my notes in the early editions of this, it just says Rack, Shack, and Benny because I didn't know how to spell these names. So I'm just going with Rack, Shack, and Benny. All right, so this is These are some of the guys that were kind of chosen. They are some of the best and brightest in the entire southern kingdom that had been chosen by Nebuchadnezzar. And in Daniel chapter 3, we read this amazing story of courage and character in the midst of pending doom. It really is amazing. And it's a story of uncompromising faith in God, as well as a story of the protection found in God's presence. And so that's what we're going to look at. In Daniel chapter 3, beginning at verse 1, says this: King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide. Anybody know how big that is? Me neither. I didn't look it up. So I was just hoping somebody could bail me out. I was reading it this morning. I'm like, I really should look that up. I don't have time. But anyway, it was a fairly large statue. And it says that he set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And he summoned the satraps and the prefects and the governors and the advisors and the treasurers and the judges and the magistrates and all the provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image that he had set up. So the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the advisors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the provincial officials assembled. By the way, just a quick pause. You know why they assembled? Because the king said so. He says, listen, this is going to happen. I'm inviting all of you guys. And all of them showed up. When you're the king of an empire, when you're an emperor, people do what you tell them to do. There is no, well, let me think about it. That's just kind of the way that it was. So they all came to the dedication of the image that he had set up. And they stood before it. Verse 4 says, and the herald loudly proclaimed. Herald wasn't like a guy. It wasn't like his name, Herald. You know, he was a guy that he probably just had the best voice. He just had a really loud voice. And so they just said, hey, he's the herald. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, nations and peoples of every language. Now pause. You know why he would have to say that? Is because they have all of these people from all of these other places where they've captured people. So he's saying, listen, this is an all play. You don't have to be a Babylonian. If you're from Israel, that means you guys. You guys are included in this. Nations and peoples of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into the blazing furnace. So I'm just going to pause right here and kind of look at some of this. I want you to imagine, so the king, he gathers all the important people in the Babylonian Empire for this huge dedication. And the command is very clear. It's so clear, he says, listen, here's what you're going to do. You're going to fall down and you're going to worship or you're going to die. That's it. You fall down and worship or you die. It's a matter of life or death. The stakes could not be higher. Yeah, we need to understand this because sometimes we read these Bible stories like, yeah, I know the ending. Many of you know the ending, right? You know the ending, so you're just like, yeah, well, we know what happened, so it's not a big deal because we know what happens. But imagine being there, not knowing what the ending is going to be. It's a life or death situation. And a few verses later, we find out that not everyone follows the command. There are 3 young men who follow the one true God, the God of Israel, who refused to bow down and worship the image. And that brings us really to our first application point. Here it is. Standing for God is better than falling for idols. Standing for God is better than falling for idols. And that's what these courageous young men did. They literally stood for God. They refused to bow down and worship an idol. They refused to take part in idolatry. Idolatry was something that God just despised. It's why he gave the first 2 commandments of the 10 commandments were forbidding it. The first commandment is no other gods before me. The second one is no graven images. See, God is extremely jealous and he says, listen, I made all of this. I created all of this. I made you. I made everything that you see, everything that you don't see. And I want you to know that this is all my work. So don't go worshiping, don't go giving credit to anything else other than God. Standing for God is better than falling for idols. And perhaps you're thinking, well, check, I'm good with that one because I don't have any idols. I don't have, I've never done that. Man, I love this one so far. This is a good one, right? Well, you know what idolatry is? Here's a simple definition of idolatry. It's misdirected worship. Misdirected worship. See, God wants us to worship him and to worship him alone. And anytime we worship anything other than God, that's idolatry. It's not just bowing down to some graven image. It's not just bowing down to a piece of wood or stone or metal, something that's been crafted to look like something. Idolatry is so much bigger than that. And idolatry in the Old Testament, it was a huge problem, and we see it all over the place. We see the consequences of idolatry. We see how kings that once followed the one true God brought idols into their lives, and all of a sudden it destroyed entire kingdoms. And yet idolatry is more than just bowing down and worshiping some man-made image. It's much more than that. So in fact, I want to look at some modern idols that we struggle with, things that we have a tendency to fall down before. First one is this: possessions. Possessions, materialism is the accumulation of stuff. If we can just have all of this stuff, then our lives will be complete, right? We make ourselves bigger houses, right? So we can hold all of our stuff. We have huge closets that are just full of stuff. How many of you have a closet, just confession time, that you have a hard time getting stuff in your closet because it's just so full? Don't look at your wife, all right? It's just like, if I could just squeeze one more shirt in here, Maybe if I put it already is sideways. How else can I do this, I mean, it's just our closets are so big, and then we rent out self-storage units because we have so much stuff, right? Stuff that we will never see again. How many of you have a garage that you can't park a car in? Like 4 of us, really? Absolutely. Yeah, we just have so much stuff. We have attics and basements, stuff, more stuff. I mean, we just have so much stuff. We have, and a lot of our stuff isn't even paid for yet. Right? We don't even own our stuff yet. I mean, we're still making payments on the stuff that we have. We just have so much stuff. Our possessions is an idol. Money can be an idol. The Bible says that the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Then you have the prosperity gospel out there where you have preachers that are saying, listen, God just wants you to be healthy, wealthy, and wise. God wants you just to have all of this stuff. That's how you know that you're a true follower of his, is he has blessed you with all of this stuff. Possessions is an idol. The second one is power. Power is an idol. If we can just have this career, if we can just have such and such an income, if we can have all of this knowledge, because knowledge is power, right? If we can have all of this knowledge, or maybe a title, if I can just get a title after my name, if I get a title before my name, if I can just, really get all this stuff, people will be impressed. So we try to make our name or make a name for ourselves. And success is just such a huge goal for us. Remember, what's the definition of idolatry? It's misdirected worship. It's when we place a higher value on something or even someone than we do on God. The next one is pleasure. Do you see how they're all, they're alliterated? I just want you to notice that. I spent so much time with alliteration. Anyway, I'm just kidding. It really came so easy this time, so I'm like, I'm going to go with it. I don't care if people like alliteration or not. So pleasure, that's something that we strive after. Pleasure, if we can just make ourselves happy or make ourselves feel better about ourselves, and it doesn't matter what it is, it doesn't matter whether it's good for us or not. As long as it gives us that pleasure, whether it's sex or alcohol or drugs, or whether it's illegal or illegal drugs or pornography or food or hobbies, things that we love. I hate to say this, but I wrote in parentheses on my paper, I put hunting. Oh, I don't want to say that. But there are things that if we place such a high importance and we make that a greater priority in our lives than we do the worship of God, it has become an idol to us. And we need to be so careful because it's one of those things that sneaks in. See, we'd recognize it really easily if we bowed down to it, right? We'd be like, oh yeah, that's totally an idol. You know how we bow down to our idols in today's culture? We just look at where do we spend our time and where do we spend our money. That's how we know. That's kind of like the checklist. This is getting kind of convicting, so I'll move on, right? Here's another one. Number 4 is popularity. Popularity. We place so much emphasis on, if I can just look a certain way, if I can have a certain body image, if I can be funny enough, if I can be athletic enough, if I can just be smart enough, if I get enough likes on Facebook, if there are enough people that comment, people must really like me. And so popularity becomes an idol to us. Listen, our goal as Christ followers is to follow Christ. Right? That sounds simple, doesn't it? Our goal as Christ followers is to follow Christ. It's to live for Christ. And standing for God is better than falling for idols. And unfortunately, we fall for idols more often than we'd like to think. By the way, you know what the antidote to idolatry is? It's to love God with everything. Love God with every fiber of our being. In fact, Matthew 22:37 gives us the antidote to idolatry. Matthew 22, Jesus replied, this is what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to love the Lord our God with all of our heart, and with all of our soul, and with all of our mind. There's the antidote. And then verse 38 says, this is the first and greatest commandment. And verse 39 says, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. See, the antidote to idolatry is to love God with everything. And then secondly, love other people. Make them a greater priority than all of your stuff, all of your possessions, your power, your pleasure, your popularity, all of those things. Now, if we do that, if we make God first and foremost, if we stand up for God, it certainly will make us unpopular in our culture at times. We'll be considered weird. But let's face it, you're probably never going to get thrown into a fiery furnace because of it. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were men of character, and they were willing to risk their lives for God rather than to worship a meaningless idol because they knew this one simple truth. They could protect their lives or they could protect their character, but they could not do both. And I think that's true of us as well. You can protect your life or you can protect your character, but you cannot do both. Now think about this with me. And I'm not just talking about our physical life. That may be true. With our physical life, we may face persecution to the point where we're trying to decide, do I protect my character, my faith, or do I protect my life? That might come true to us. But I think if you think about it from the sense of, our life is accumulation of everything that we do, everything that we have, all of these things. Think about it from the perspective of our way of life. You can either protect your way of life and all of your stuff, or you can protect your character. But you can't do both. You can't have it both ways. That's why Jesus said so many times, listen, if you want to follow me, you got to leave all this stuff behind. See, we can waste our lives trying to protect our possessions and or our hunger for power, or our desire for pleasure, or our need for popularity, or we can invest our lives trying to please God as men and women of unflinching character. By the way, if you want a quick definition of character, character is how God knows you to be. That's what character is. See, your reputation, that's how people think you to be. But your character is how God knows you to be. Character is who you are when nobody else is watching. You can protect your life or you can protect your character, but you cannot do both. Standing for God is better than falling for idols. Let's move on. Verse 7, Daniel 3, verse 7 says, therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, and all the kinds of music, all the peoples, or all the nations and the peoples of every language fell down and worshiped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. At this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. And they said to the king Nebuchadnezzar, may the king live forever. Your majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound, and they repeat the whole thing verbatim, right? Who hears the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the pipe, and all the kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold. And that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set up over the affairs of the province of Babylon. Sounds like somebody may be a little bit jealous, by the way. Maybe I'm reading into that. But there are some Jews who you set up over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold that you have set up. Verse 13 continues, furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar said to them, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold that I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I have made, then very good. Now, I think that's interesting, by the way. Just a quick little pause. He must have liked these guys. I mean, kings and emperors, they don't normally give second chances. Maybe he's thinking, maybe you're not understanding the language quite yet, so let me make this really clear. I'm going to give you one more chance here. I'm going to give you another opportunity. And then he says, but if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. And then check this out. He says, then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? A little bit of arrogance going on there, isn't there? Once again, we've read the end of the story. We kind of know how it's going to turn out. So we're like, yeah, don't worry about it, guys. You'll be fine. Put yourself in their shoes. And the king is telling you, listen, you have got to fall down and worship this thing or you're going to die. Have I made myself clear? Point number one is standing for God is better than falling for idols. The second one is this. Standing up for God will get you noticed. Standing up for God will get you noticed. For better or for worse, right? You're going to be noticed. Can you imagine how these three young men must have stood out? Can you imagine that? Everybody else bows down, and then there's three guys, I'm sure, right next to each other, not bowing down. They must have stood out like a sore thumb. I mean, have you ever stood out in a crowd of people? Anybody stood out? When I was in college, I think Rita knows where I'm going with this. When I was in college, a group of us college students went to a concert, and it was a Christian concert. It was a rocking concert. Point of Grace was there. It was a pretty conservative college, okay? So some of you are like, who's Point of Grace? Well, anyway. Point of Grace was the concert that we were going to, and this is going to, we're Christian college students at a conservative college, so we're going to go listen to Point of Grace. It's going to be awesome. It's like, woo, we're going to, And so here's the group of us that are going, and well, you know how before the headliner comes out, which is Point of Grace, I mentioned Point of Grace. By the way, they liked my hair. Anyway, that's another story. Before the headliner comes out, there's usually an opening act, right? There's another artist that comes out and they do their thing, and they're not quite as popular as Point of Grace or anybody else. And this was incredible. So here we are. There's a couple thousand people or so in the room, and the opening act comes out for Point of Grace, and my roommate stands up, and is kind of clapping, which is pretty cool, except for he's the only one standing up. And he's like 6'4", okay? And we're towards the front. Couple other thousand people there, and they're like, sit down! It was so embarrassing for him and delightful for me. Oh my goodness, I felt so bad for him because he, once he stood up, he was committed for it. I give him credit because he's like looking around, nobody else standing, nobody else clapping, and he didn't do I'm going to do this for a little bit, and he once he was committed, he went through that entire first song all by himself. And that song probably to him felt like 43 minutes long, even though it was probably just 4 minutes long. When you're standing up in the middle of a crowd and nobody else is standing, you're going to be noticed. You're going to be noticed. So can you imagine these three guys standing up? Everybody else is face down. And there they are, standing up for God. See, standing up for God will get you noticed. And in the way I see it, they were noticed by at least three different observers. You have the astrologers, right? Verse 8 tells us about these astrologers. It says, at this time, some astrologers came forward and they denounced the Jews. So they were basically just tattletales, right? I'm not going to ask for a show of hands. How many of you like a tattletale? It reminds me of the Brady Bunch. Anybody familiar with the Brady Bunch? Brady Bunch? The dad, he always had all these incredible things. I remember his thing about the tattletale. He goes, a tattletale is really just telling a tale on themselves. They're telling a tale that they're a tattletale. Now, is that a tale you want to tell? See, you can commit that to memory, parents. These were some tattletales. And it says they denounced the Jews. Now, they weren't just trying to get their hands slapped. The word denounce means that they tore them to pieces. They tore them to shreds. These were accusations that were severe, and their intent was to destroy these three guys. And I believe that it was motivated somewhat by their own jealousy. By the way, this still happens to us today, and we're not talking about astrologers here, but we're talking about, when you stand up for God, people are going to notice. Other people are going to notice. Sometimes it's people that are jealous of you. Sometimes it's people that just, they want to see bad things happen to you. When you stand up and you do the right thing, it's going to upset some people. Sometimes it'll make them look bad. So you have the astrologers. Another person that observed this was an angry king. So you've got this angry king. Once again, kings of empires, they're not known for their patience. They certainly don't like it when they're shown up by other people. I think this happens also in our culture, and maybe it's not an angry king that we need to worry about. But we can sometimes draw some unwanted attention from people that have higher authority than us, can't we? Whether it's a boss or the court of law or some other officials or a board or a special interest group, just some people that have some authority. And like, man, I don't want to cause any problems because this person, they could make my life difficult if I do the wrong thing or if I do the right thing, and depending on how you look at it. If I do the right thing but they don't like it, and, man, that could make somebody angry. Now the third observer is the most important one. It's Almighty God. Almighty God also observed their behavior. This is the one that you want to please. This is the one that you want them to take notice of you. You want them to see you doing something right. You want to get caught doing the right thing. Can't you imagine how proud God must have been at that moment? Seriously, can you imagine that? Can you imagine God gathering the angels around and said, check these guys out. Man, talk about courage. Talk about boldness. Watch these guys go. Way to go. I imagine, now, this is just my imagination, but I imagine that when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood to their feet to worship the one true God, I imagine all of heaven stood with them. That a boy. These are my guys. I love that. God must have been so proud in that moment. See, standing up for God will get you noticed. And even if you feel like you're standing all by yourself, you need to remember that God is with you. But let's face it, trusting God is risky at times. At times, trusting God has some consequences in our lives. And in our culture, it's not likely that we're going to be killed for our faith, but there's still some risks. There's still some consequences for following Christ in our culture. Let me give you just a few. These are some cultural risks that we face. Number one is ostracism. You can be ostracized from your family, from your friends. I know some of you, that is your story. You've become a follower of Christ, and maybe you're the only one in your family. You're the only one. And so it's a little bit awkward. There's a little bit of tension at some of your family reunions. You kind of have to walk around on eggshells. How do I say things? How do I interact with people that are nothing like me, that have a totally different set of values? Perhaps you feel rejected. Or it could be just with a group of friends, you were close to them, but now you're not so close. People have distanced themselves because of your relationship with Jesus. It's a risk that we face. The second one is loss. Loss, it could be the loss of anything. It could be the loss of a job. It could be the loss of a promotion. It could be the loss of friends, the loss of influence, the loss of respect. The third one is slander. People start rumors. People say things that aren't true, or they say things to try to get you into trouble or to get you to react in a negative way. The fourth is bullying, whether it's physical or verbal or emotional, just this unfair treatment. There are lots of consequences that lots of risks that we need to understand. Am I willing to face this? If I stand for Christ, am I willing to endure this? Once again, you can protect your life or you can protect your character, but you cannot do both. So which one are you going to pick? Now, because they recognized the presence of God, even in their current fiery situation, they chose to follow God and to rely on His protection rather than dishonor God. See, there's protection found in God's presence. So let's read how this story ends up. Verse 16. It says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him. So they're before the king now, and he's given them one more chance. He's given them the ultimatum. I'm going to give you one more chance. You obey it or you die. So they replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this manner. Wow. Talk about courage. And you'll see in a moment that they did it respectfully, though, right? Grace and truth. Remember we talked about that? Speaking the truth in love. Talk about courage. King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this manner. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and He will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if He does not, we want you to know. He's like, okay, you were pretty clear with us. We want to make sure that we're clear with you. We want you to know, your majesty, still respectful, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude towards them changed. Remember, we kind of get this idea that, I think he must have liked them. He gave them a second chance. Now there is no second chance. He is furious. His attitude has changed them, so he ordered the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter than usual. And he commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to throw them into the blazing furnace. So you get the idea that he's trying to set an example here? So he gets the strongest guys and he throws them into this blazing furnace. And verse 21 says, so these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. And the king's command was so urgent and the furnace was so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now that's a pretty hot fire. I don't know what that temperature would need to be, but I'm sure it's over a couple thousand degrees. It is hot. And these 3 men, verse 23, and these 3 men firmly tied fell into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement. By the way, I would venture to guess that kings don't leap to their feet very often, especially in amazement, right? They've spent their entire life being entertained and hearing it all and seeing it all. And so he leaps to his feet in amazement and he asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men? I love this. Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire? And they replied, certainly, your majesty. He said, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like the son of the gods. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening, I'm sure very cautiously, by the way, approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego." Notice his tune is already changing a little bit here. "Servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." Can you imagine this? So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. Can you imagine that? And they saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed, and their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel to rescue his servants. They trusted him, and they defied the king's commands, and they were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore," love this, verse 29, "therefore I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego will be cut into pieces, and their houses be burned into piles of rubble. For no other God can save in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. It's amazing. It's so amazing. I love it. Standing up for God is better than falling for idols. Standing up for God will get you noticed. And then here's the other thing. God shows up when we stand up. God shows up when we stand up. Don't you just love this part? I mean, talk about the presence of God. It is so unmistakable. God is totally in this. You know, even if they see three people and they're walking around, they got to know something is up. Something has happened. Something that is unusual and miraculous has taken place. But in this case, he looks in there and he sees four people walking around. It's the presence of God. It's written all over it. Now, when I get to heaven, I want to ask this question. Okay, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Rack, Shack, and Benny. Can I get your attention? I bet you when I say Rack, Shack, and Benny, they're like, oh, here we go again. Here's another, I know what era you were born in, right? Rack, Shack, and Benny, I got this question for you. What did Jesus say to you? What were you guys talking about? Tell me what that was like. Can you imagine that? Imagine that little conversation, that little interaction that took place. It's amazing. I love it. There's protection found in God's presence, and God showed up when they stood up. And I look at it, God showed up in at least three different ways. First one is this, that God protected his followers. He protected his followers. There's protection found in the presence of God. I mean, these guys didn't even smell like smoke. Now, if you've ever been around a campfire, you know you leave, you smell like smoke, right? I was in the bank the other day after, being up at the cabin, and the lady at the bank like, were you around a campfire? I'm like, maybe, yes. Yeah, you smell like smoke. And these guys didn't even smell like smoke. Now, it's interesting that there are some that deny, anything miraculous in the Bible. And I was reading this earlier this week that some people have tried to explain this away. And they've been like, well, actually, they were just in one of the cool spots in the furnace. I'm like, are you kidding me? There's a cool spot in a furnace? Really? Like maybe it was only 1,000 degrees? Anyway, I just thought that was interesting. But God protected his followers. Love that. Can I say this? For years and years and years, I heard an expression. Don't agree with it yet, okay? So when I say the expression, don't go like, amen, because I'm about to say that the expression I think is wrong, okay? For years and years and years, I used to hear people say that the safest place to be is in the center of God's will. Don't agree with that yet, okay? And I get what they're saying. But, listen, it's not always safe to be in the center of God's will. I do agree that it is the best place to be is in the center of God's will. See, God doesn't always come through in this way. In fact, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they had this unswerving confidence, and they said, listen, God can deliver us, and he will. But even if he does not, we're not going to change. Listen, sometimes God may ask you or tell you to do something, and it may not be safe, but it is what is best. It is what will draw the most glory to him, and it is the thing that will point other people to Christ, even if it costs you something very dearly. And for these guys, God certainly delivered in a miraculous way. But we also need to get to the point where we say, God, even if this isn't safe, even if this doesn't make sense, even if you don't come through the way that I thought that you would come through, God, I am still going to trust you no matter what. And so while it may not be true that the safest place to be is in the center of God's will, the best place to be is in the center of God's will. So God protected his followers. The second one is this, that God promoted his name. He promoted his name. You see this verse 28, it says, then Nebuchadnezzar said, praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Do you think he would have ever said that before? Those are words that he had never spoken until this point. Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who had sent his angel to rescue his servants. They trusted him. And they defied the king's command. And he's putting himself in the story. Listen, they defied my command. And I'm still giving praise and glory to the one true God. They were willing to give up their lives rather than to serve or worship any God except for their own. And then he says, therefore I decree that peoples of every nation and language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're going to be cut into pieces. And their houses will be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way. Talk about a turn of events. Don't you love it? I mean, they're thrown into this fire for standing up for God. Now the king is going to execute anyone who speaks negatively against this same one true God. The name of God was most certainly promoted here. He says, no other God can save in this way. Then the third one is this, that God promoted his followers. He did. He promoted his followers. Now, is God always going to do this? Not necessarily. Certainly not in this obvious of a way. But we see that in verse 30 it says, the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. See, these three young men, they were not only protected by God, but they were promoted by God. They didn't lose their status. They actually received a higher status. And it reminds me of this timeless biblical principle that hopefully you've heard us say before, that God honors that which honors him. God honors that which honors him. You believe that? That God honors that which honors him. And when we honor God, when we choose to obey his will and to live a life that is pleasing to him, that God is honored by that. God honors that which is honored, that which honors him. And certainly we want to see God bless our lives, right? There isn't a person in the room that says, nah, I could do without the blessing of God in my life. Nobody says that. We want to see God bless our lives. But listen, we've got to make sure that our lives are blessable. We need to make sure that God, if you're going to honor, if you're going to be honored in my life, God, I want to do things that are honorable. I want to do things that are blessable. Man, there are just some incredible lessons from this campfire story about the presence of God. Standing up for God is better than falling for idols. Standing for God will get you noticed by everybody, even those that you don't want to be noticed by. And God shows up when we stand up. I don't know about you, but I want to do a better job at standing up for God. I want to do a better job of standing for my faith, even in the midst of a hostile culture. I want to do a better job of that. I want to experience God's presence in every situation that I face. I want to experience that so much that when other people see the situations I face, that they can also see God's presence. That was the case with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? Everybody noticed, hey, there is something about these guys. And there was something appealing about that. Is that what our world needs? They need men and women of courage, men and women who are going to stand up for God. And when that happens, I believe that God will show up. Let's live our lives focused on pleasing Christ, letting our faith shine so that people can't help but notice Jesus.
And your whisper makes your fire.